big, expensive water treatment facility. We simply improve the sustainability upstream. The upstream landowners did it because it made economic sense for them. They received the right incentives. And the downstream users, obviously, from the taxpayer perspective, it's less money spent and the same benefit at the end. So wow, how can we make this model apply in different areas, these type of relationships? At the same time, we also have the carbon markets. And this is another type of payments for ecosystem services where we're not operating in the same landscape, where we don't have the proximity between the beneficiaries and the providers. We don't have those that are downstream, such as residents of the city, or in other cases it could be, for example, a hydroelectric company that wants to avoid siltation in the river from which it uses to produce energy, and provides incentives upstream for people to plant trees to retain the soil. Those are the type of local level payments for ecosystem services. At the global level, we have payments for carbon. We have incentives for people to plant trees, to restore ecosystems, to conserve forests, to basically reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm sure you all have been at least somewhat familiar with the recent discussions on how we can include these types of carbon mitigation projects, reforestation, avoided deforestation, forest conservation as a means of conserving forests and at the same time combating climate change. And so this is sort of the other side of payments for ecosystem services at the global level, where the beneficiaries really are the global community, who obviously need to do something about climate change, although the leadership doesn't seem to always follow what arguably the public opinion is requesting. They would benefit from having projects around the world mitigating the impacts of mitigating the emissions of greenhouse gases. So the providers would be owners of forests, managers of forests, stewards of forests, or of reforestation projects. Here we have one example in Tanzania, which is a reforestation project. And so there is a market out there for individuals, for companies, for organizations who want to do their bit in combating climate change and would like to invest in these types of projects where they're getting their benefit through the form of ecosystem-based carbon credits, reforestation project, avoided deforestation project. So again, we have sort of that same relationship between a provider and a beneficiary. Here, though, they are a bit far removed, so the connection is not so direct. The beneficiaries are basically everybody who is interested in combating climate, who has an interest in combating climate change. So in today's world, it is mainly those of us in the developed world who actually do face constraints and do face a historical responsibility to do something about it. And so we can fix that by investing in projects such as these. So that is the basic landscape, I would say, in a nutshell, to be very brief, of payments for ecosystem services. That there's different forms of them. They apply at different scales. There's different types of beneficiaries, different types of providers. In some cases, it can be a private landowner. In some cases, it's a community. In other cases, it's the government itself who owns the land and who can then enter into these transactions. But what does it mean, international payments for ecosystem services? We've had, so here I'm taking you back to this first workshop that was held in September of 2006 to think about international payments for ecosystem services. Here's a concept for you people out there who are working on payments for ecosystem services, who have been documenting stories such as what happens in New York, what's happening with the emerging carbon market, what's happening with new types of market-based schemes, innovative conservation finance schemes, such as biodiversity offsets and habitat banking and different ways of trying to use markets and use new tools to support conservation. It was about 30, 40 experts that were united in 2006, and it really was quite a high caliber group. I was just there to take notes and write a report at the end, but was very impressed by the quality of the participants. And it was a very interesting discussion. And I think, well, I guess the next slide will will provide a bit of clarity on what sort of the main outcomes of this were. Obviously, the simple fact that we had so many people present and attending this workshop showed that it was an issue that had a lot of interest, and I think that a lot of people saw it as something that had potential. But we still didn't necessarily succeed in getting a clear sense of direction in how IPS could best be used. And at the most fundamental level, it wasn't really sure what the purpose of IPS should be. However, I think there's three main lines of argument for what the purpose of this International Payment for Ecosystem Service scheme would be. What would it do for conservation, for development, for biodiversity? And there are the three here. First of all, the main purpose one of the main purposes of IPS was to address the critical funding gap for biodiversity conservation. A lot of people voiced the concern that we have a global market for carbon, recognizing that our atmosphere is a public good and that we need to correct sort of the externality of pollution of the atmosphere through greenhouse gases, through market-based incentives, forced carbon markets, for example. Why can't we do the same for biodiversity, which is also a global public good, and which also needs to have the same type of internalization of these values that are not being captured. Recognizing that, well, there isn't enough money to support existing networks of protected areas, biodiversity is being lost continuously. Why not use this new popular tool to address that funding gap for biodiversity conservation, just as along the same lines as carbon markets, basically. Another sort of mandate for this IPS, and it also is important to mention that the Convention on Biological Diversity was not an official partner of this initiative, but in close collaboration with the initiative, very interested in how we can use innovative financing mechanisms to support the convention. So there was a bit of a mandate from the international community, from the Convention on Biological Diversity, to help implement their programs of work. So there was obviously gave some legitimacy to the overall initiative. And then finally, as I've tried to convey earlier, PS was at the time very popular and seen as something that held promise and something that could be scaled up and capitalized upon. And so that in itself was a major justification for pushing ahead with this notion of international payments for ecosystem services, because payments for ecosystem services was a promising tool, and most importantly because it had a potential to reach previously unengaged actors. It was able to capitalize on this new language put forward in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment of Ecosystem Services, and which was able to sort of widen the scope of those people that actually had an interest in conservation, an interest in the environment. So that was, again, something that people felt could be capitalized on some more. So looking a bit more into these different issues or different reasons for which IPS was seen as being a worthwhile cause and a legitimate initiative to push forward. First of all, the funding gap. Here we have a graph which gives some indication on the overall percentage of the conservation costs being met, and what we see is that in countries such as the United States, in North America, to a lesser extent in Australia, New Zealand, and Europe, governments are pretty capable of funding their own conservation schemes, of funding their networks of protected areas. In developing countries, not so much. We see that those levels are quite low there. And the recent compilation of sort of data on the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, the global study T, in 2010 provided even some more evidence, more data on how much money is needed, how much money is missing from the budgets of protected area networks, for example. And here we have some idea of the order of magnitude. So that is still a very legitimate concern, and even today, we're still looking for ways to address this funding gap. So, one of the first efforts of the IPS initiative, one of the first sort of deliverables that people focused on was understanding the demand, trying to figure out, okay, we have a big gap, we see that people in developed countries are quite able and willing to conserve and manage their biodiversity, their protected areas. Those networks work relatively well, not so much in developing countries. Understandably so, it's not a priority to the same extent as it might be in developed countries, a completely different context. But we also know that people in Europe and North America are interested in biodiversity for its existence value, just by simply being aware or simply having the knowledge that biodiversity exists in the world. So therefore they have an interest in conserving biodiversity outside of their countries, again as reflecting the global public good nature. So one of the first initiatives we did with IPS was to do a survey, and this was done locally out of Geneva in collaboration with the university there to try and figure out how much an average citizen, so we did a random sample of collecting inputs, soliciting inputs in the streets of Geneva and Saturday afternoons with some students. I think we got about 600 or 700 responses, over 600 responses, asking them basically how much they'd be willing to pay to conserve tropical forests. And then asking them different questions, if they've ever been there, if they ever intend to go there. It was a typical contingent valuation study, for those who are familiar with that. And we found that there was a mean willingness to pay of 90 Swiss francs per year, so I guess it's about 60, 70 euros nowadays. Quite significant. And another finding, particularly interesting of this study, when we were doing our analysis of what determines this willingness to pay this amount, we found that those who would be willing to pay quite a bit were highly motivated by biodiversity. We asked them which of the different attributes of tropical forests they found most interesting for tourism purposes, as gene pools for pharmaceutical research, different, obviously the social aspects we asked about as well, the carbon benefits, and biodiversity was the most positively correlated with a high willingness to pay. So there is a demand for global biodiversity. Still not sure how that can be captured. And also still recognizing that there isn't that much money being put into biodiversity currently. And this graph is just simply to put a bit of perspective in terms of how much money is currently being spent on official development assistance, public money, compared to overall assistance money, and then obviously foreign direct investment, just to bring the message home that although there is this relatively high willingness to pay, a strong interest, there are no markets, there is no means of actually capturing those values, and in the world we live in today, it's completely marginal in terms of the broader financial flows that are out there. So still a very legitimate concern and major challenge for the international biodiversity community to try and keep on addressing that funding gap and making biodiversity more relevant to economic decision makers. So the second aspect of the IPS mandate is the CBD agenda, the Convention on Biological Diversity. Here I've made explicit mention to a specific article that was made during the Conference of Parties. This one was back in 2006, which requires parties to adopt economically and socially sound measures that act as incentives for the conservation, and sustainable use of biological diversity. I think the most important thing to bear in mind here is that payments for ecosystem services, international payments for ecosystem services, is seen as a means of mobilizing more resources. Again, building on those slides I showed you previously, the members of the Convention on Biological Diversity, most of them are very much aware of the need to find new